Conas T, this is Sorcha jumping in quickly with a couple of quick announcements. We are running our very first retreat in collaboration with House of Legends and some other wonderful storytellers and musicians and creative people. This is going to be running from the 10th to the 13th of August 2023 in the wilds of High Hild Alban, today known as Scotland. There are very few places still left available, so you can follow the link in the show notes to grab yourself a spot. We have a live show coming up in Whelan's, Dublin on Sunday the 20th of August. You can find tickets on our website through the link in the show notes. And if you are listening to this in the future after that date, you can still follow that link to find out what shows are currently coming up. Hope to see you there. And now, back to the regular podcast.
Conas T, how are ye? Welcome to a very special edition of the Candlelit Tales podcast. We tell stories and we talk about them afterwards. And today we are joined, my name is Aron, of course, and I'm joined by my sister. And very, very excitedly, we are joined by Alan Titley, the author of On the Táin, a new telling of the Táin. And we're going to be having a discussion about this writing in this book and having Alan's input. And hey, by the way, if you want to go to patreon.com/Candlelit Tales and give us a bit of support, that'd be great. Or if you want to check out his book, you can do that too. Now, Sorcha, who are we talking to?
So we are talking to Alan Titley, who is the author of this new edition of the Táin, which is a beautifully illustrated book as well. And it is a lovely modern retelling of this ancient story. So Alan very kindly has come on the podcast to have a little chat. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Alan.
Okay, well, no, that could be very brief. It could be very long, you know.
I suppose, very importantly, I should say, Alan, it's great to have you on board. You're an author, but also, more importantly, you're from Cork. It's great.
That might be the most important thing.
That is the most important thing.
You would know. No, I was born in Cork a long time ago now, which probably looks like that. But I was just raised in an ordinary enough house. There were three children. Went to Turner's Cross National School, Clough 3 secondary school after that. And after that has happened, didn't know what to do with myself. And myself and another fellow decided, well, let's be teachers, but not be secondary teachers. We were going to leave secondary school. So we said, let's be primary teachers. And nobody knew anything about how I became a primary teacher. So we discovered and we applied to get a place in the teacher training college, as it was known at the time. So up we went to St. Patrick's College in Drumcondra, where I spent 2 very happy years, in fact 2 very educational years, because there were people there from all over Ireland. And it was a boarding school, which we hadn't been. We had the freedom of Cork City before that, and that was a lot of freedom, as you could imagine. And therefore you were meeting people from Donegal, from Kerry, from Dublin, from Westmeath, from the Midlands. They were everywhere. And you would spend most of the time just talking to them at night, because there was nothing else much to do until we began to discover Dublin. So that was an education in itself. And then instead of the intention was to go and get a school, and probably in Cork, and there were several that I knew of. But one day I happened to be out playing a hurling match, and a friend of mine, in fact I didn't know him that well, but we were, because you knew everybody, but he wasn't a special friend, and he came along to me and he said, he was from Dublin, so he didn't say come here manch. He said whatever the Dublin equivalent that is. So he said, would you be interested in going to Nigeria? So I said, yeah, why not? And I was fortunate insofar as my parents were always very, very open and very freedom giving. And I remember when I was in secondary school, my dad used to give me a couple of quid. A couple of quid went a long way, and a tent, and more or less say, get lost, go away for a couple of weeks. And I travelled Ireland and Scotland and England, just travelling around the place. And this was in the 1960s, okay? Yeah. So when I went home and said, look, I'm going to Nigeria, I do think, it's kind of years later, I felt they were disappointed. They wanted me to go, but they wouldn't stop me doing anything. And what was even worse, I suppose, was that the war was on, the war between Nigeria and Biafra, which is about the Nigerian Civil War. And I went to Nigeria just after it started, and I left just before it finished, which meant I was there for 2 years. And I saw war, I saw bombing, I saw soldiers going mad, there were roadblocks, there was censorship, and I met bombers, I met all kinds of people. And again, that was another kind of education, because suddenly there were people from all over the world. So having come from a place where I'd met people from all over Ireland, I now met people from all over the world. And I meant there were Russians, there were Algerians, there were French, there were British, and of course there were the Nigerians, the Africans themselves, who were very, very different as far as when we talk about Nigeria, we talk about Africa, we're inclined to think of they're all the same. But no, there was Tiv and Yoruba and Igbo and Hausa, and there were and you could tell the difference, and you would know the difference. And they were very different. They were more different than people from Cork and Kerry are, and that's different enough.
That's different enough.
And so in that sense, it was a great education. I should say, without going too long about it, that I did write an essay for an Irish language magazine while I was there. It was spotted by certain censors. I learned this years later.
No way.
My post was being opened. One day I was arrested. I was charged with loose talk.
No way.
Yes, I was. I was plonked in jail for a couple of days.
What did you say in the letter?
I was speaking about the Biafran War, and what I was basically saying was, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I was saying basically, if you had 30,000 people massacred over a couple of weeks, which I had, then they had a fairly good reason to secede from the rest of Nigeria. Right. Because it was secession. Said that's a reasonable point to make. And of course, Nigeria, they wanted what they call territorial integrity, and they weren't going to. They didn't want any of the colonial places to break up, which of course is the problem with Africa. As we know. So that's
Lines
what
drawn by colonisers are always.
Oh, that's it. And
always a problem.
They drew lines in the map, just where General Lagar and somebody else came, they drew a line, as it was. And I was lucky while I was there. I did manage to travel around a lot of West Africa. I nearly got to Timbuktu on my own. I travelled across the coast to Togo, as it was, Dahomey, as it was, into Ghana, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, up into Mali. Wow, and I was on my way to Timbuktu. This was serious. But I had to get back to the college I was teaching in, and the river had dried up. So I bought a few postcards, and I wrote postcards from Timbuktu, and I gave them to some Americans who were going there. So there are several pals of mine in Ireland who had cards from me from Timbuktu. So, it was a great adventure. But the best thing was, it said, because we were teaching, we'd get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you finish at 1 o'clock. And eventually the rest of the day to yourself. And I discovered that if you had a siesta, I would sleep for the rest of the day. So I decided, no, I'd take no siesta. So instead you'd read or go for a swim or go for a walk or go for whatever it was. So apart from, I said, meeting people, I managed to read stuff of all kinds, so world literature, if you like, along the way. And I did produce plays with the kids in the school as well, two African plays, which was also very revealing, because they knew nothing about theatre. I knew very little about theatre. I'd been partly involved in a few plays along the way. But I said to myself, let's do this. And I remember the crowds came along, and I was afraid they'd forget their lines, but they didn't. And it was we had great fun along the place. And I still have the old tattered manuscripts of the plays. So I said, and I don't think I've ever produced a play since. It was a hard lesson. But when I came back to Ireland, having been released from jail, I had to promise not to return to Nigeria ever. I had to sign a letter. I have a lot of stories about what I do, which would take a long time, but it was fascinating. Came back to Dublin, and my girlfriend at the time, I'd met her before I went out. We commuted all the time. She's now my wife, and so we came back, and so I said, I'll try to get a job in Dublin. But I visited a friend of mine in the School for the Deaf in Cabra, and I was talking to him, and one of the brothers came along, and he said, I believe you're idle, you've no job, would you like to teach here? So I taught there initially for a couple of weeks, and then when the summer came, he said, would you like to come back? So I came back. And so then I did a degree at night in UCD. I did Irish, English and philosophy, a past degree. And when that was finished, I decided, well, let's go on a bit. And I had a choice between doing Irish and philosophy, because I kind of was reasonably good at both of them. I did Irish because I was always interested. I was always good at school. And and then I decided to do a master's degree. And when I was finishing the master's degree, I saw an advertisement for a job as a lecturer in Irish in St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, where I had been 5 years beforehand. And I went in and I applied for it, and I got it. And I was in there for 32 years, which was a great place, because I was teaching teachers how to teach, insofar as you can teach teachers how to teach. But I was teaching basically Irish literature and Irish stories and Irish poetry, and as well as that, then there was an educational component when you go around and see the students in schools. And because I had been a primary school teacher myself, and in fact, I shouldn't really say this, but seeing you're talking to me, I actually got first place in teaching in the college when I was leaving. I got a gold medal. So I was kind of good at this. What I was
Getting in there.
So I had to say that much. So they wanted me to do this kind of stuff. And that was another time where in the summer, in June and September, we were sent out into the wilds of Ireland. And so I began to learn about schools around the country, and it was very enjoyable. One of the places I got, and I was going to it for 20 years, was Donegal, so I kind of was in every primary school in Donegal. And you saw teaching from another point of view, and and that was fascinating as well. So I was always interested in education, and one of the things that strikes me is, and I've a daughter of mine who is a teacher herself, primary school. You have another daughter who is involved in teacher education as well. So this kind of thing happens, runs in families. But in schools nowadays, there's all kind of new gadgets, and there's interactive whiteboards and so on. And yet, from my own experience of being in schools and teaching in universities abroad as well, I think teaching is the same no matter what you do. And it is about what you're about. It's about talking. It's about being able to tell stories, being able to command attention. And I used to see if seeing students in front of a class, you would know within a minute, 2 minutes, whether they would be a good teacher or not. Could they talk to the kids? It was very simple. Could you talk and could you communicate? And a great way actually was to get them to tell a story. And there was a big difference between telling a story and them reading a story. And I'd always say to them, don't read a story, tell it to them. Because if they read a story, at least not all of them, but some of them would they'd be talking away like this in a normal thing, and then they would say, once upon a time, there was a little girl called Sally, and this kind of boring voice would come on and say,
the automatic information.
Get the book, chuck it out there and tell them the story along the way. And you could see it, and you could do all kinds of teaching. I thought came down to a kind of storytelling. If you were doing history, you should tell them a story. And the kids would love it.
I remember that I remember having a very good history teacher who just did exactly that. She barely looked at the book. Told us the stories of the different people in history. And
it's fascinating.
It's fascinating.
And the worst form of teaching was the teacher who would take out the book and say, we are now on page 56. Read the next few lines.
We're going to read it and underline it for the next 45 minutes.
It was terrible. But as I said, I remember even maths lessons. And I remember when I was a student teacher teaching a maths lesson, and I was teaching several, but I used to kind of make up stories about, there were 18 guys in this jail, and 5 of them escaped, 2 of them were caught
in a Nigerian jail.
The kids were, this was a prophecy along the way along. But kids would love that. So it's a very basic way of talking about anything, is telling stories. So that's how it is. So that's how I ended up for 32 years in St. Pat's. And then I got an offer of a professorship in UCC in Cork. So off we went to Cork.
Back
home as well.
And what brought you into mythology and folklore?
Well, you see, if you're dealing with Irish as an academic subject, everything is included in that. If you do a primary degree in Irish, okay, you do the language, you do linguistics, you do sociolinguistics, you do dialects, you do folklore, you do stories, you do poetry, you do literature, you do the whole lot. So no one person is an expert at them all. So there are bits of it that you just don't like. I mean, I've been interested in a lot of things, but I wasn't interested in grammar. I mean, your grammar has to be good.
Order.
But people do, I know people who are excited about grammar. I know people who could learn languages by picking up a grammar book. Now, this is totally strange to me. But I was never that interested. I wouldn't be interested in sociolinguistics or much of that kind of stuff, but I was interested in literature. So in that sense, you'd and I kind of started off. There was a great Irish storyteller, a novelist, Máirtín Ó Cadhain from Connemara, and he wrote Cille, which I translated as the dirty dust, and it's all the people are dead, and they're all telling stories about themselves, and they're bitching and giving out and arguing and complaining, and it's a great and the great thing is novels, and I did a PhD on the novel in Irish. So novels were what I was doing. And the old story was that E.M. Forster, the English writer, said, oh dear, a novel must tell a story. And what he meant by oh dear, it does much more than that. It does, it tells about character, it tells about place, it tells about history. But the important thing is there has to be a story there.
You've got to have a plot in there
You've got to have a plot in there as well. And the plot will carry all the rest of it along the way.
Yes.
And I have a daughter who's in London, and she writes. She's written plays and she's written comedy, and she wrote some plays when she was a student. And they didn't have many stories in them. I remember kind of taking her to one side and said, Brona, you must have a story. If you have a story, you can tell all the jokes in the world. And I think that's true. I'm not saying she took my advice, because daughters don't take father's advice all the time. But on the other hand, she's a great kid.
I mean, so by the sounds of it, like you've always been surrounded by the oral, whatever you want to call it, a tradition, but the way of telling stories, from being in college with people, spending time in Cork, exchanging stories, finding out about people in different parts of the country, to literally people in different parts of Nigeria, and finding out through the exchange of story, exchanging information, exchanging language, whether it's history or a cultural significance. I think there's a broad experience of story, and then your study within that, and it's kind of another appreciation of how story can be used for not only education but inspiration and the good things in between, and re-educating yourself in that. And I suppose the question, or let me rephrase her question. What was it about folklore mythology that hooked you in terms of the Irish context, and wanting to go back to it, and ultimately leading to writing it down?
There were various bits. I mean, I remember the thing about folklore was, I remember being interested in some of the tellers of tales themselves.
Okay.
And I remember there was a teller of tale, Sean O'Connell, from out in the Cahersiveen Peninsula in Kerry. And they collected a book of stories, Sean O'Connell's book in English, Leabhar Cheannaigh Chunnel, which amounts 400 pages. And this guy, he had never left his native area. He'd never been in school. He spoke no English. And he had a head full of stories. And I thought this was amazing. And there were others. There was another tale of a guy up in County Clare, when Irish was kind of getting lost or falling into disuse. And a folk tale collector came along, and he was looking more for Irish than for stories. And they said, well, there's a guy up there in the Burden, and he's a good Irish speaker. They went up to this guy, and again, he had hundreds and hundreds of stories. And I read of these storytellers in Connemara who took a week to tell a story. Some of those were written down. And the Irish Folklore Commission, which was set up in the 1920s, they were collecting this stuff all over the place. Now, a lot of it doesn't make great reading when you actually pick it up. It doesn't make great reading, because it is a performative thing. And I know from Scottish storytellers, and there's a great tradition of storytelling in Scotland as well. And I speak Scottish Gaelic as well as Irish, one of those weird things we love the way. And I remember listening to recordings from the School of Scottish Studies, and they were, in some reason, because maybe the tradition was stronger when they began recording it, they were a lot more performative. They would act different parts. So somebody would, which they didn't always do here. They would, a storyteller could often be kind of not so much monotonous. Some of them were better than others. But I heard these guys, and the voice would raise up and they'd shout, and you'd hear them almost bang against the furniture. And they were actors along the way. So it was a form of, it was all, because there was never a big theatre tradition in Irish in Ireland, because we didn't have the theatres. You weren't allowed to have them. There wasn't an audience. They couldn't build up a stage. No, but we were able to tell stories. So the storyteller did all the parts himself, or herself, but himself or herself. And I mean, when people say, if you mention to people of a certain age, you mention the dreaded word Peg Sayers, people say, who hated this book when they were in school.
Again, it's written down, of course they hated it.
But Peg Sayers was a great storyteller.
Of course she was.
She was a brilliant storyteller. And I mean, and to keep getting more of her stories recorded and being put out. And even if you didn't have very good Irish, you would understand every word she said. Every word was cut out like a diamond. You went, and I thought that was fascinating as well. So there were bits like that. And I remember reading about again, he was a Scottish academic, and he did work on storytellers in former Yugoslavia, probably Serbia, one of those places. And remember, do you know the way you read a book and you forget most of it? And this was a book
Yes.
that I was studying for an exam, and I kind of forget most of it. But I do remember him speaking about the storyteller, and he said to somebody, if you give me 4 words, I will be able to make up a story about it.
Yes.
And I thought, that's an amazing thing. And there are people who can do that. You simply
Aron
say,
does that.
here are 4 words, off you go. And he did.
Aaron does that with children. It's a forgetful storyteller story where he
Well,
says,
yeah,
once
that's-
upon a, what was it again?
Yeah, that's-
And gets them
and
to
off
give
you
him
go.
the prompts,
And
and off he
you
goes.
can do it. But that's that kind of... So the storytelling was interesting in a way that was both creative, on the one hand, and at the same time there was memory.
Yes.
And
Right.
no 2 stories were the same, and they never told
And
the
you
same
never
story
tell it
twice.
the same way twice.
You never tell the same way twice.
I've actually come across a word, and I can't remember what it was, but that Shanachie is the keeper of stories and folk beliefs and names.
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure if is this correct, but is a Skeelty or
Skeeltor?
Skeeltor more along the lines of telling the stories, or telling like a storyteller, literally, without the connotation of remembering the names and the places and the people?
I think Shanachie would be used as a generic term. Okay. It would cover the whole lot.
Right, okay.
And originally it came from more or less a local historian. Okay. So the Shanachie would remember all the things that went on in the area, and then maybe he or she would remember, would be good at place names. They would be good on, there might be a story about a place name. Another person would have local lore. So nobody really, you'd never have a whole lot in one person, or it was rare to have the whole lot in one person. Mm-hmm. But then the Skeelí or the Skeeltoid, both words are there, would be to somebody who kind of specialised in tales themselves. Okay. So somebody like Peg Sayers did stories. Tales is what she did. And Sean O'Connell did stories. But other people did local lore, which was, strictly speaking, Shanachas with local lore, which would take in small little tales, stories about poets, stories about ghosts, story about, they would be there as well.
And the people in their own areas.
Yeah, around the area as well.
I remember
bits of poetry as well.
Our late uncle Eddie, the last Christmas that he was alive, he was the eldest of their family, but he had all of the stories of that farm in Carricknavar, the names of the fields, because every field had a name, and every bridge had a name. And I remember just getting him, our dad got him talking about all of those. Yeah,
and not only that,
stories.
Sometimes every rock had a name. Yeah. You had rocks in places. And in fact, I had a student in UCC who, as a minor thesis for her master's degree, did exactly that. She said her uncle had a farm somewhere in East Cork, and he knew the names of the fields, and he knew the names of bushes and so on, and she was going to collect them. And I said, that's great. We'll put that together.
That's a great project.
So do you know the old story about Socrates? This is a terrible name dropping altogether. Socrates, who couldn't read or write. And somebody said to him, look, there's this great new device called reading and writing literacy, and it helps you to remember. And he said, no, it does the opposite. It helps you to forget.
Do you know, that's a really interesting, that's a fantastic thing, because I think there is a way, and I think it's tangible for me in my lifetime, that you outsource memory to technology.
I was just talking about this last
night. And writing things down, I think Socrates is dead on. It helps you forget, because you write it down and you think, well, I don't have to think about that anymore. Yeah. But even if you think about those of us who remember being around before phones, before mobile phones, you used to have to remember phone numbers.
I was there before phones.
Absolutely.
In primary school, or when we got a phone, we didn't have it. But that is true. I think when you can look things up. And I used to say to students, and I did a course on folklore where I got them. I didn't allow them write anything down. A couple of lectures. I'd get them. I'd say, come in, sit down, get rid of books and all that. Sit there and listen. And I would have no notes. I would just talk as well.
Yeah.
And I was trying to tell them that in the time before reading and writing, not only was there not reading and writing, people didn't know it was there.
No.
Because it was not there at all. So the concept of it wasn't there. So how do you know anything? You ask somebody.
Yeah.
So then so a guy like Sean O'Connell, the guy from Kerry, how would he remember 400 pages of stories? That's phenomenal. Yeah. I often say to people, how many jokes do you remember?
Yeah.
How many jokes did anyone of us tell? Unless you have a knack of remembering them.
Yeah.
I knew a fellow who, in the olden days when there were bus tickets, remember bus tickets? He'd roll a bus, and he'd write down, he'd take out his, and he'd be able to tell the jokes, But that was, and there are ways of if I'm trying to remember a song, or we'd say you're in a session of singing, which happens very rarely, but it might happen along the way. It does happen. And I might say, right, I know a song. There's one from Cork, there's one from Clare, one from Galway, one from Armagh, one from Dublin. So I kind of have the map of the songs in my head, and then I would remember, I'd know which one to sing. So to remember the story. I think you can do the same with jokes, You could say a joke about, which we can't tell, but you could do it along the way.
Along the way. You've some jokes that you save for different audiences.
We were just going through a litany of jokes down in Cork. My dad and his dear friend, a bishop who died tragically recently, who used to call him on Christmas Day and tell him a joke that he would have to tell to Tony, because otherwise he'd end up telling it on the pulpit. He wouldn't trust himself.
He'd tell our dad all the risque jokes that were a bit too spicy for mass.
Well, that's a great. But I mean, jokes are stories too.
Oh yeah,
they are.
And they're the stories that tell us something along the way. And stories always tell us something. That's why you remember.
The best jokes are a little bit of a chapter. You get a little bit of a story about.
You do.
That's right. Whatever it is, he's driving down the road and there's lots of cars going the wrong way.
Well, and you also get, I mean, this was the other thing.
Keep going, that sounds like a good story.
Right, so your man gets back and the wife is like, oh, Johnny, you're back. God, they've just moved to America. Oh, my goodness. So good you're back. There was a lunatic on the road and who was driving the wrong way. One of them. There was hundreds of them. It was a very summarised version of that.
What they do, it's how we know things. And I mean, the other thing that amazes me is with small kids is that you can tell them stories. In fact, our youngest fella, Fergal, we would tell him stories and tell him things before he could speak, and he would remember them when he eventually began to speak.
Wow.
So a kid will pick up a story, and a kid will know that the story is not true, in the sense that they can tell the difference, at least I think they can, between reality and fantasy. Yeah. And if you make up a story about your Donald Duck or a cartoon, they know this isn't real. And people kind of get upset because there's too much violence in the Roadrunner, or in, they get squashed, this kind of stuff. Sorry, kids know that this is not true. And they know when you tell them a story about giants, they know there's not giants there. When you go over the bridge, there aren't 3 trolls under the bridge. At least you hope there's not along the way.
Yeah, I mean, there's that little kind of mysticism and belief in the magic that is literally a certain level of brain development where there is a magic kind of realism or kind of some form of. You go through Piaget's levels of development or whatever you want. They have belief in their own, and then they kind of externalise it.
Oh, it does, and it happened to me when I was in primary school. We had a teacher in first class who told a story every Friday afternoon.
Nice. And
he spent maybe an hour telling a story. And he... I remember Sinbad the Sailor was one of them, he'd tell you Robinson Crusoe, and obviously his own version, and he was very good at it, and he sat down. I have a funny feeling he even smoked a pipe. He might have been allowed to do that at various times. But I do remember he did tell us the story of Sheanna, which is basically an Irish version of the Faust story about the guy who sells his soul to the devil.
Yes.
And there's an Irish version of it which Tahir Padder O'Lear, a famous Irish writer from Cork, put together a famous first novel, and he told a story, and I was scared because I thought the Fardove, the black man, which you couldn't say, but that was what it was, that he was around various corners, and I wasn't sleeping at night. And my good old mother, who God knows never complained in her life, she came up to the school and said to the teacher, he's not sleeping because he's afraid of... So the story obviously affected me so much.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew it was a story, but at the same time, this guy could be lurking around the place.
He could be lurking anyway,
that's what I mean. There is always a line of that belief.
It's a fascinating link, But that's how it goes. But it's endless. And I said before we had novels, people told stories. And then there were the other big ones about, if you take the great classical poems like the Odyssey or the Iliad, and there's a big discussion, did Homer ever exist?
Yeah.
Or was it cumulative? And I think the Táin is something the same. I mean, the way I look in the Táin, or indeed of any story, is somebody somewhere made it up.
Yes.
And that's the thing to remember with all mythology. And like, I think it's beautiful to admit it a little bit. Like, you know, I'm going to go, okay,
no,
well,
there was an original author who made it up, who pulled it together.
There was, yeah.
And I think that's, you know, for all fairy tales and folk tales, somebody made it up. The ones that the thing about it is that it is then iterated on and added to and taken from, and bits are added and bits are left out in different retellings. And so it evolves from that original point. And we kind of don't, you know, we don't know, like we often talk about, like, is this the real version of it? You just sometimes get the question of, like, is this the absolute authoritative version? And it's like, well, no, because whoever made up that original version is long in the ground.
Yeah.
And whatever version we are telling now bears some resemblance, hopefully, to the story that they first came up with.
Yeah, and depending on which version or which translation you're looking at, even like I was chatting to the guys up in Loughcrew last night about the Boyne and the original, the Boyne River. It was mentioned, like, the version, there's one version where she's tenacious and Boan goes out against Knockton's wishes, and there's a beautiful description of the cup bearers, which always cracks me up, as the guardians of the well. But then the other
this
version,
being the story of the well of knowledge that overflowed because she looked into it and chased her down and drowned her.
Yeah, but the next version is she's proud and she wants to walk around 3 times.
She's defiant.
She's defiant. Yeah, sorry. And as a result, her kind of femininity is punished by standing up against.
Yeah. But again,
it's a twist. But it's
I think
similar.
that's a way of, like, that's one of the interesting things about telling and retelling, is that you can take the same sequence of events. A woman looks into a magic well, and the well creates a river that drowns her, and you can tell it from a point of view where she is brave and curious and transforms herself into a river and runs a circle of protection around the house where her son will live. And you can tell a version of it where she is, women need to stay in their place, and if they step out of line, bad things happen to them. And so you can slant these stories in different ways. And that's what I think is so interesting about, you know, storytelling as a sort of a creative practice. Because you also have that thing of, you can choose the story that you think is appropriate for the time. And you can choose the story for the audience. And I think that's one of the things that the old storytellers would have done as a kind of a function of the community, of like, okay, this community is getting a little bit, there's some stuff happening in this community. We're going to tell this story to remind everybody of these values that we've had.
Ideally, yeah.
If you take, you say, the Brothers Grimm, who collected all their stories, and a lot of those stories, like Little Red Riding Hood and the 3 Little Pigs and those ones, they were a lot more gruesome than the versions that we have. And I mean, some people say that it was because they were always set in the wood, like Hansel and Gretel set in the wood. And the idea was that you were to scare kids from going into the wood, because you get lost. There were wolves in there. There were really wolves in there.
There were genuine wolves.
There could be anybody. There could be all kind of people, you know, with kind of fires and ovens and all kinds of stuff along, as in Hansel and Gretel. And a lot of those, like in Red Riding Hood, she gets eaten up by the wolf in the original story.
Yep.
And that's it. There's no woodcutter to come along, you know. Hansel and Gretel get burned. That's the end of that.
That's it.
But they started tacking bits on to kind of, because these were too savage for nice little kids in big cities to read.
Yes.
But for the kids in the countryside, that's what they were meant to be. So yeah, they shaped them. But what's interesting is, apart from everything's interesting, is when you mentioned the Táin or the earlier story, is what was the initial impulse? And I was trying to work out with whoever composed or made up the Táin. Did he start with Maeve? Did the idea of Maeve come to him? And was there such a person?
Yeah.
Or was there just somebody else of that name or of a similar name? Was it about 2 bulls? Because there were bulls fighting. There was bull baiting in Ireland up to the 18th century. I mean, it survives in Spain, Mexico, and other places along the way. So that was, and there was bear baiting, but that was more in places where they had bears. So, but was it that? Was it bulls? Was it Maeve? Was it a war between Connacht and Ulster? or South Ulster to be more. What was it? But somebody put it together, and it started somewhere in somebody's head. And there may have been different stories about Cuchulainn, because like Cuchulainn is one of the heroes, like the heroes of Troy or the heroes of Greece or the heroes of India. He's just one of those. He's our version of them. Fionn McCool is another one of them. So, anybody can go on making up stories about them. And those stories were being composed and invented right up to until Irish kind of went into decline in the 19th century. You had people getting newer versions of them, and so so it wasn't. I suppose the tradition wasn't creative much after the 19th century. Some people like Eddie Lennon and those are adding to these stories along the way, but very few people are.
I, in terms of the Shanachie Scale-Tory, that kind of like line, I would kind of almost class Eddie Lennon in that, like, as close to an authentic kind of Shanachie as you can find, because he's really has made a massive attempt of like recording and rewrite and keeping as many stories and beliefs and people's aliveness with names in locations as you can, which is kind of slightly separate to looking back at the older myths, I think. But again, they're all linked in this imaginative process that we so desire in our human condition, to be swept away in something that is, other than what's going on in front of us. And we need stories to learn from, but we need stories to excite us. We need stories to mentally chew on. And whether they were being created up until from the 19th century or not, and then retranslated and added on to, and like they're the greatest stories that have lasted the longest time.
I think the stories that speak to us are the stories that we want to keep speaking. So there is that kind of thing of like it is a culture in conversation with itself and with its own past, and in negotiation with those values and in renegotiation with it.
But they're also recycled.
They are recycled,
and they're recycled. We say in films, where we say you have Superman or Batman, they're the same. They're the Cuchulainns. They're the few.
They're the Cuchulainns, and I think that's a really interesting thing about kind of modern culture, is retelling the hero stories over and over again, and not telling king stories, not telling goddess stories, not telling queen stories.
The omission.
So you have this weird thing where we are kind of stuck, and so many of the superhero stories, they keep coming back to the origin stories, they keep coming back to the coming of age, they keep coming back to the young warrior, and the young warrior is an immature archetype. It is not like Cuchulainn is not a grown-up. He never grows up fully. There's that kind of thing of like, that's sort of his tragedy, is that he never really matures. He dies before he's able to, which is kind of, that's sort of the thing for the warrior. The warrior has to die either by growing up or by going out in a blaze of glory. And so it's a very unbalanced thing for a culture to put all of its stories into the warrior archetype.
Because you're looking at overcoming...
try and build a culture based on that.
Because you're overcoming the obstacle through... we usually pig-headedness and violence.
Violence and domination.
Whereas
that's the warrior way.
Yeah, the trickery or the cunning or the guile.
I mean, there's a bit trickery and cunning and guile in the warrior as well. But it is always about, the warrior is about asserting your will on the world, and damn the consequences. Whereas there are other stories, like I think the king stories are more about reconciliation and balance and rebalancing. And the dangers of not doing that. Like you think the Conor O'Moore story where he breaks his gassa and the weight of the other world lands on his head,
Yeah, it's in a sense then in Táin that you have both of those together. You have a king and queen story, and you have a hero story.
I think so.
Both of them kind of come together, and that might be an attraction of it.
I think so.
But on the hero element, and you're perfectly right. But the other Irish hero is Fionn McCool, and Fionn McCool does grow old.
He does,
and he dies, and he becomes a kind of a dirty old man in his own way as well. So it's a different kind of a thing. But then the Fianna, such as they were seen as those warrior groups that when young men, reached a certain age of 15, 16, 17, they burst out and they lived outside the community for a wild couple of years. It's like certain cultures where they set them aside. They had it in Germany. It's like, go away and sow your wild oats, be mad for a couple of years, and then come back in, and they'll come back in to defend the community. So those kind of archetypes were there as well. But as I'm saying, yes, it is the same one coming around and around and around. But why the gods and the goddesses stories are not told to the same extent. I mean, I know a lot, read a lot of Greek mythology from time to time. I can't grasp them in the same way because they're not alive to me in some ways, and they're not around about, and they're just kind of hero stories in a way. But like Cuchulainn himself he had two fathers. One was a human father, and the other was a god. So there seems to be that the gods are there first. They kind of become partly human, and then they turn into heroes, and then you come down to the novel where they're ordinary people and they do ordinary things. So there's a funny kind of
an evolution there.
There is an evolution of
or degeneration,
maybe,
maybe.
Well, or a recreation in your own mind,
recreation,
and that's why it feels, I think, more alive. And I feel the same way in terms of Irish mythology, because it's so prescriptive and done and correct. When you're reading Greek myths, they're brilliant. I love them. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's you know exactly the lineage. You can go back and find out who's.
There's a very clear family tree. All of the gods are related to each other. They're all siblings.
They're all siblings, and they're all But you can track exactly what kings and who's and where the descendants were.
Well,
again,
it's a culture that we've been kind of talking around this. That's a culture that developed writing fairly early. Yeah. And so they were able to write down their gods and the lineage of their gods while it was still a very living belief system.
That's true.
Whereas the first writing system that came to Ireland was brought over by Christian monks and missionaries. So our first written record is by people who were coming from a different belief system. So there is I mean, and I know this is a debate in academia, and it feels to me like one of those absolutely unanswerable questions of how much of our myths were made up by monks?
Great, yes, that is one of those questions. In fact, there are some stories about the Druids, and we don't know that much about them. There's a lot of rubbish spoken about the Druids, but that they actually opposed writing. That the important thing was to remember the laws, remember the stories, remember the genealogies, memory was the important thing. And yes, when the monks came along, they began to write it down. So the gods were already gone by the time they began to write them down. And obviously, because Christianity took root so quickly in one way, but there's some evidence that there were places not Christianized until the 10th or 11th century in Ireland. People say that. So the old gods lived on in a shadowy form. They lived on. But so it's very hard, as you were saying, to reconstruct what the Irish gods and goddesses were like.
Yeah.
And I've tried a few times, not very seriously, kind of write down and make a diagram of them, and you can't, because they're all and some of them are the same person twice, and then others are, and there's a whole, and they're all kind of they're very messy, and you know who they are and what they're doing and what they necessarily stand for.
Which all Éilís is this now again?
But we do know that they were there. I think that's the point of them. So Manannán, the god of the sea, what was he doing? He just ends up in the Isle of Man. Just that's it.
I love even a great example of a god who seems to be prehistoric, it doesn't make sense in this context. Primordial, but existed before maybe even the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbolg, that whole story. Was he there already? Or, a version of something that I read recently of that he was part of the Tuatha Dé Danann and died and then came back as this god of the sea.
Yeah.
And where was it? Was it chicken? Was it egg? Was it before? Was it after? Was it somewhere in between? When who decided that exactly, or when do we need a Poseidon? Actually, lads, I heard about Poseidon. We have one here too. Actually, his name is Mana. Or tying that link together and knowing that we need a.
But there might even be an earlier, when you were talking the Boyne, the river, was the rivers were gods. Or they were, as is the case in Hindu mythology up to the point when the Ganges grew out of Shiva's head. It was not quite. It started and flowed along the way. There may have been an earlier religion, and there's some evidence for this, where we talk about Christianity as being a sky religion. In other words, God is up there. We're all up there. And the older Irish religion was an earth religion. The gods were in the ground. So they were in mountains, and they were in lakes, and they were rivers. And then
talk about Shiva, like Shiva's arm, Shiva's legs. That's all the mountains in the Himalayas around.
But a lot of those stories remained, and they kind of were changed into into fairies, and I don't like using the word fairies, but it's the she is a better word for it. Because
Yes.
when you say fairy, it conjures up these little fairy
Disney
creatures.
Tinkerbell things.
I have this conversation.
Whereas the she in the Irish tradition, they were like us,
Yes.
You just and there are some great stories. There's a great Donegal story about which I used to use to demonstrate something else, about a young girl who was out tending her cows one day, as she would, and a big frog hops along, and she throws a comment saying, "My God, you're a big frog. I'd love to be there when your children are born." Stupid comment, you might say. So that's fine. She goes back home to her cottage that night, and lo and behold, a man arrives on a white horse. They always arrive on a white horse. And the man knocks on the door and says, and she's an only child, a young girl, and he says to the mother and father, "Hey, I'd like to borrow your daughter for the night," which of course is a rather strange request at the best of times. But I'll bring her back safe and sound in the morning. So being simple folk, they get up on the back of the horse and off she goes. And they gallop away through the night, and they arrive at a mountain, and the mountain opens, and in she goes, and it's full of people in there. And there's a woman in the bed giving birth. And when she gives birth to the child, they take the child out and they burn the child in a fire. And all of the people there, they come along and they put their fingers into the ash, and they rub the ash on their eyes. And off they go. And the young girl does the same. She only manages to put one finger in and rub it in her eye. And the man stops her, puts her back on the horse, and off she goes. And she goes back home. And then a few weeks later, there's a fair nearby, and she's at the fair. And while the fair, as the story says, she saw many people at the fair that other people didn't see. Yeah. And then she met the man who brought her on the horse, and she said, "Hello, how are you?" And he's shocked, and he says, "How do you see me?" And he said, "I see you with this eye," pointing to the eye. And he put in his finger and he plucked out her eye, said, "You'll see me no more."
Yeah.
And the point of the story is that the fairy folk, the she, are all around us.
Yes.
But they're in a different dimension.
Yes.
And that dimension was kind of the Irish otherworld was next to us. It was here, or it was sometimes underground or in the rivers. It wasn't in the sky. So that's a folk tale that was collected, I think, in the 20th century in Donegal. Yeah, so that's there all the time.
I've heard that.
I've heard elements of that. The ointment on the eye,
Yeah.
and the
Slightly different beginning.
punishment.
With the horror.
But again, this happens in folktale a lot, that you get similar motifs in different stories and arranged differently.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really
brilliant description of it, though. Yeah.
That's a great point of that idea of, in the Celtic mind, the other world, the mystical, the magical, the transcendent. It's not above us, it's immanent, it's around us.
That's right.
It's surrounding us. We're passing through it without knowing.
Right.
This room is not just the three of us. There's a crowd of people here, and we can't perceive
I'm getting
it.
scared now.
Well, you see.
I know.
But
That's what I always say to kids. I'm like, there might be one of you. Are you one? I think you're one. You
you
definitely
could be.
look
You
one.
got the look one about you. But it's that idea of it's not apart from us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, and a lot of that
Guys,
stuff about
I have to tell you,
the
this
silver
morning,
branch and bran and
I was
seeing things differently.
up in me this morning.
Oh,
and
yeah, you were late.
I was late. But I was up I stayed in Lockroad with friends, and we went out to see a field that is hopefully going to be purchased by Gaelic Woodland Project, and they just showed me a field of ancient hazel or hawthorn trees, and there's just something about that tree. It's so, just showing pictures of it, it's so gnarled and twisted and twined. It's really hard to tell what age it is.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful and it's rare, and I've never seen it other than in you'd see hawthorn up and around Tara, and you'd see them in some of the sacred sites like Gur as well, and you'd just see them kind of kept in places, and oh yeah, that's yeah. But this was just a field. There was a ring fort down the road around the corner, but 500, 600 meters away easily, more, and then you put this field of random trees, and I swear, when you're next to those trees, it's just you do feel like you're in another dimension, because you're sitting there, and suddenly I was sitting on a rock, and they all had rocks underneath them. All of these ancient hawthorn trees had rocks that were perfect for sitting down, and the hawthorn tree comes down, and there's light passing of rain as we were this is a perfect umbrella. There's this these rocks
Perfect
have been
spot
here,
to shelter.
and just tell stories and talk. Like it's an ideal place for imagining, for conjuring, for coming up with poetry, song, story. It's that harbouring of imagination, of like, and you're in the ground. Your feet are in the earth, and the trees and the bark of the wood.
Well, you kind of
is
feel
around
like
you.
you're being brought down by the tree because
Yeah.
it is pulling you down. It is keeping the sky away from you.
Yeah.
It
And
is
some of those
bringing you
trees
into
were
your-
sacred as far as I'm
Absolutely.
concerned. And in fact, in the early Ogham alphabet, and letters later on, they were given the names of trees.
I've
So
heard
that's what
that.
they were
Yeah.
names of trees.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they'd be
yeah.
so trees were seen as being important because
The native
writing
trees, yeah.
when writing came in, it was seen as something special as well.
Yes.
There's no. I remember reading a story. There's an Irish writer, to Irish, Eugene Waters, and he wrote a short story, a short novel for children, basically, about somebody who learns how to read, and he goes to a man who can read, and the man is reading, and he says, the book, is it magic-y? And he says, yes, those letters are magic-y. And I thought it was a great way of describing, writing
Yeah.
and reading as well, which
Which
is
is-
not often done,
It's not, but I mean the word for spelling and the word for magic spell are the same word at the root, because to be able to write something down and encode it and keep it for later is an incredible piece of magic. And when we're talking about it as a new technology, and a technology that was rejected by Druids, which is
love that.
a great idea until there aren't any Druids left to remember the sacred knowledge, and then we just don't have it.
And then suddenly, thump.
Yeah. Well, this is it. If you put it in people's heads, you're locking it away to an extent. But I think it's a really interesting thing because we're talking about the stories as a culture having a conversation with itself over time. But however much I love the oral tradition and telling stories and retelling stories, aside from recording, and we don't know how long recording will last, we know that we don't know how long the servers are going to keep humming and how long the power plants are going to keep feeding them power. But paper is strangely indestructible in some ways as well. Like actually writing down a book and having it there, that becomes an artifact that then is part of this great, long, slow conversation. And somebody can come back and read that in 150, 200 years. So where did the inspiration or the impetus for writing it down come from to you, Alan?
For writing the toy down or writing anything down?
Well, I mean...
Well, writing the toy down happened because I was asked to do it by Young Island Books, by Little Island Books. I still call it Young because there's a New Ireland Books as well, so New Island Books as well in Killing. Well, these are for the younger people, but it's Little Island, which are great publishers. And I was involved in something else at the time. And I said, look, I'm not going to do this. And then they kept at me, and I said, okay, I'll do it. I kind of know the story because a bit like everybody, we heard elements of the story in when we were in school, and there were stories about Cuchulainn, and all of this was sitting there. And then, as well as that, of course, I had studied the text, the Old Irish text, when I was in college myself. And even though I can kind of read Old Irish, I wouldn't be an expert at it, but I could read enough of it. So I knew that. And then there were more modern Irish versions of it. There were folk versions of it. And then there was the other versions, the Thomas Kinsella one, the Kieran Carson one. And then there was another one done some years ago by Little Island as well, Liam Gushton, which is why they asked me. They said, that one is 30 years old, and maybe you need another one now. So there's the retelling of the same thing. So these were all in my head, and that's really where it came from. I may not have done it otherwise. It wasn't necessarily. I mean, I've written a lot of stories in Irish myself, and some of them are based on folk tales. In fact, that folk tale that I was talking about, the one about the squirty eye, I wrote a play about that. But we didn't use a different actor every night for the eye, we just we pretended that we didn't pluck the eye.
You didn't go through the eyes, yeah.
So there's several stories that you can turn a lot of those stories into plays. You can turn them into novels as well. So this was more a labour of love, in the sense that I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to like doing it, and I have to find out more and more about it. So what I did was I read and I reread the stories in the various languages and bits of them, and I kind of took notes. And the important thing for a book for younger people, I think, is that you get the spine of the story. You find out what were the major things that happened, because there's a lot of extraneous killings and people being massacred and blown apart and guts spilled all over the place. And because they're only names, it's not that important who they are. So I guess what's important was, the row between Maeve and Alan, which is a very human thing. The two of them lying in bed, and one starts giving out about the other,
I want to stop you just briefly before we jump into the Táin, because you very subtly mentioned the Táin a couple of times, and we kept on steering you away. And you were like, this is a good segue, but there's loads more. And it's been a fantastic chat. And I just want to take a little break and give you an opportunity to have a drink, have a cup of tea. If you're driving and you want to have a listen, and keep on driving, well, you can do. But we're going to have a pause there because this is a brilliant chat. And I really want to get into the Táin in a little moment. So let's have a little break.
Let's take a little break. And if you're listening to this as it comes out, we'll see you next week.